All right, well, my name is Beall. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Calgary in healthcare policy. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Thank you, everyone, for coming to hear this presentation. Okay, so let's jump straight into it. Great. Okay, perfect. Nice. Okay, so in terms of what I plan to talk to you about today, we're going to talk about patent term restoration, why that matters for drug innovation, and why that matters for drug access. And the whole reason why I thought it would be a good idea to talk about it is that Canada in 2017 began implementing this policy. It's now in effect. So it's particularly relevant here. A lot of other countries have been observing patent term restoration for quite some time, particularly in the US. They've been doing it since the 80s. And I recently wrote some papers on what that experience was. So it seemed like a good time to talk about it, both in the context of the US experience and then also based on that experience, what we might expect in Canada. So we will talk about the basics of pharmaceutical patents. We'll talk about the basics of patent term restoration extensions, and then for both of those, why this is important to drug developers, and also why this is important to patients and clinicians and those who are working on drug access issues. And then I'm going to give you two examples, as I said, these studies that happen to coincide nicely with this talk. One was just published last month. And hopefully we'll get through both. If we only get through one, that's okay too. So please stop me if you have questions at any point, because we're going to talk about a lot of really specific rules and laws regarding this topic. So the first thing you need to know is that most drugs are protected by patents, and these are issued out of the patent office, which does not have a specific objective to improve health. Their objective is to create innovation, and that those innovations will lead to commercial endeavors that will improve society. So there are three criteria in order to grant a patent. It needs to be new, and it can't be published, for example, in a scientific paper previously. It also needs to not be obvious to someone who is trained in state of the art. It needs to be a significant jump in thinking. And then finally, it needs to be useful. And a lot of patent laws is written around in terms of usefulness, that it has a commercial application. So why it matters for drug developers is that patents protect that specific market for the patent that has been issued. And the way it protects it is that it says that that particular patent owner is the only one who can sell in that market. Someone else could come in and sell in that same market, but that would be considered infringement, and then they would have to take them to a court to get compensation for that. So that's generally how it works. And so I think that the role that patents play in terms of drug development, well before the drug has even made it to the market, it adds a lot of credibility to what the drug innovator is trying to do. I've had the opportunity to watch a number of these pitches for new drugs, and the first questions always have to do about exclusive markets. How is this going to be turned into an actual business? What's your plan surrounding that? And drug innovators constantly have to say, we have a patent, or there are other regulatory exclusivities which they can cite. but it does seem to play a very obvious role in that whole process. So it's important to know the system adds a lot of credibility, which will attract investors, and that allows them to justify putting quite a bit of resources into further developing that project. So the standard patent term is 20 years, and it provides this temporary monopoly. After that, the market is opened up to everybody. And during this market exclusivity period, it is up to the drug innovator as to how much they charge. And a lot of times that's just based on what the market will bear. However, in the case of medicines, sometimes there are price control mechanisms to limit how much they're actually able to sell their product for during that exclusivity period. I've done some research on how long it takes to get a drug from the actual invention of the molecule marked by the application of the patent for that molecule, and oftentimes it's paired with a scientific publication, to actual regulatory approval. I found this to be about 12 years. So if you have only a 20-year patent, by the time you make it to market, a lot of time is lost. So to account for that, some countries, including Canada now, will reimburse some of that time. And it depends on the formula that's used as to how much time is given back on the end of the patent. And we'll get into some of those specifics. But that is the overall spirit of the policy, is to compensate for the amount of time that's taken up satisfying regulatory review and clinical trials. Well, actually, I'll break down the components of these 12 years here in a minute. So the longer it takes to develop a drug, the shorter the exclusivity period on the other end of it. So this works as kind of a natural mechanism by which the development is getting too expensive to advance to the market. It becomes much harder to justify putting that amount of resources in if there's a very short exclusivity window. So this is the problem that patent term restoration is attempting to address. So I mentioned before getting a breakdown of PreMarket Times. This is what it looks like right now. So to get the pre-human testing, this is when toxicology and so forth is done. We're measuring the time between the first patent application for that product and when human testing began. So that's what that block of time is. So there's a lot of science that happens prior to that, just getting to the point where they have a molecule which they think is therapeutically useful. So what you see here is just the translational medicine component. So if you added in more, you could arguably say there's a lot more time that should be accounted for. But in terms of just bringing the product from bench science to the market, this is the breakdown. So for human testing, I should have said, by the way, this is in the US. For human testing, it's a median of almost 6 years. And then there's regulatory review, which is a median of less than a year. I should note that sometimes it can take longer than that, but the sample of drugs that this is based on is for entirely new chemical entities. So these have not yet been introduced on the market, and the FDA is more often in a rush to get those to patients than when compared to, say, just a new formulation, like an extended release drug. So the overall time is, just as I said, a little bit over 12 years. So without patent term restoration, by the time drug innovators make it to the market, by this measure, it would be just about 8 years. This is an overview of the entire pre-market process, just to give you a more specific sense of what those timeframes represented. And okay, so this is the U.S. formula for figuring out how long a drug innovator should get back on their patent based on what was done prior to drug approval. So what they do is take how long it took the FDA to review the regulatory approval application. They give them all of the time back for that. For clinical trials, they take half the time. And then there are some important maximums that they take into account. So they've said, we'll only give back a maximum of 5 years. When this policy was implemented in the 80s, there are a number of drugs that were in transition. So they had already entered into the approval process. There was a compromise that those drugs would get a 2-year maximum. And then, but that subsequent to that went away. So now we have, and have for quite some time, had the 5-year extension. And then the other maximum that's really important is that anything beyond a 14-year anticipated exclusivity period. So that's the time from FDA approval to when the patent on the active ingredient expires. They thought beyond 14 years would be excessive. So it will be this time subject to these two maximums. So that's how it's calculated. So let's switch to Canada's new regulation, and then we'll move on to some examples of studies on this. So Canada instituted this in the context of a trade agreement with the EU, and instead of patent term restoration, here it's called a certificate of supplementary protection. And it's interesting. It's different from the US in some important ways. So one is that they've specified the type of product that's eligible. So they really only want new active ingredients and new combinations. Although in the case of biologics, they've talked about products by process. So in the case of biologics, what is a new product? It gets a little bit more tricky, but they've carved out some language to make sure that biologics are included for this. They've also done something that I think is really clever, which is that for the product to be eligible in Canada, it has to be registered within Canada within 12 months of the drug being approved elsewhere. And they specified these specific jurisdictions. So this is an incentive for drug companies to ensure timely approval of their products in Canada. They've also said that veterinary products are eligible, which is also different from the United States. And this is all from September 21st, 2017 forward. So how do they calculate how long the extension will be in Canada? So what they do here is they take the patent application date to the notice of compliance, so regulatory approval. They get those years, they subtract 5. I'm not sure how 5 was chosen, but I believe it's in relationship to the 5 years that US products often get. And that will give the term for the certificate of supplementary protection. The limit in Canada is 2 years rather than 5. I think those are all the basics of it. So what is the Canadian experience so far? This is as of yesterday. I just updated this. So far, there have been 33 applications for human drugs. 20 have been issued. 7 are pending, and 6 have been rejected. So that's about a 77% success rate. Most are getting it that perceive themselves as eligible. And in terms of the duration of these patent term extensions, given the 12 years that we discussed earlier, you might suspect that many would be eligible for the full 2 years in Canada. And in fact, that is the case. So of the 20 that have been issued, 17 got the full 2 years. And the remaining ones were, 2 of them were pretty close to 2 years. Something else that's interesting is that 60% of these were biologics, although I need to compare that to general trends in approvals for drugs. However, drug development is starting to focus more and more on biologics, particularly for rare cancers. So Canada has put a registry of all of these up, and they are available. So this is a screenshot of what it looks like. It gives you the status. It gives you the actual application number and the patent number. So there's lots of data to dig into to see how this is going to continue to play out in Canada. Okay, so what does this mean for drug access? So as I said before, these competition-free periods allow for higher prices, and higher prices tend to constrain drug access. So that's either for patients who happen to be uninsured, but it can also be at the systems level where payers need to limit the number of patients that they can reimburse for a particular drug. Once the patent, in this case, expires, then it's open to generic competition, which can lower prices as more competition comes into that market. Just one generic competitor is often not enough to drop the price too much. You often need 3 to 4 before you see a significant drop. So another reason it matters is that when there's any restriction on drug access in terms of things like price, the full public health benefit is not being realized. So that's probably the biggest public health argument for why the end of the exclusivity period matters. So there are a lot of reasons to want to know, are exclusivity periods ending when they should? And certainly, during that time, during that extended period of time, it's possible to calculate how much payers are expending during that time, and it's also possible to calculate what the public health benefit was for that additional payment. So again, there's lots of research that can be done here. So this is the recent paper that I mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to briefly run through this, and then one other. The reason I put them together is they're actually from the same data set, but with very different focuses. So for this particular paper, the broad research question was, what is the effect of patent term restoration on the effective exclusivity period, meaning the time from FDA approval to generic entry? So there are a lot of reasons why generic entry might be delayed. There might be other patents. There might be other programs to extend patent protection. There are other sort of shenanigans that pharmaceutical companies are accused of for delaying generic entry. One reason in making this calculation is to know whether the system is generally working the way you would think it would, based on the way the laws are written currently. So the data that we used for this was we went with a compilation of top 200 selling drugs that were consistently on the list between between the year 2000 and 2012. Then we lined this up with when the first Medicaid prescription fill happened to calculate that exclusivity period, because sometimes regulatory approval for a drug to hit the market doesn't actually mean it has hit the market. So it's worth verifying that patients are actually able to access the drug. There is, similar to Canada, there's a patent term restoration database put out by the US Patent and Trademark Office. And then we also needed to figure out if these same drugs were eligible for a 6-month pediatric extension to calculate that as well. Because those same patents that have been extended can be extended again by clinical testing in children. So the analysis plan was to just get some basic descriptive statistics. So which drugs are getting extended, which ones aren't, which patents are getting extended, which ones aren't. So many drugs have more than one patent on different components. So is there a specific aspect of the drug that's patented more than others? And then how long are these patent term extensions working out to be? And then in terms of observing effect, which is really, is patent term restoration successfully extending the exclusivity period? One way we did it was just to simply make a simple calculation of how long the patent term restoration period was. The more interesting ways were just comparing drugs that had such an extension versus those that didn't, and see what the difference was. And I'll give you more details on exactly how this played out in the analysis. But the third one, which is a bit more complicated, but I think is more persuasive, is that we looked at what happened in reality. So what happened in reality was that for some of those drugs, generic entry happened right when patent term restoration expired. And for other drugs, it didn't. So what this analysis did was assume, okay, for those where where generic entry happened when we thought it did, patent term restoration really did seem to make a difference. In all other cases, there must have been other patents and so forth. So that is that third analysis. Maybe I'll stop there. Are there any questions at this point about any of this? Okay. All right, so we'll get into some results and then see if there are any more questions after that. So of these 200 top-selling drugs, we found that 170 had generic entry during that time frame. Then about half of those had an actual patent term extension. The others didn't. So limiting the study from here on to just those that had a patent term restoration. Of those patent extensions that were given, they were always on the patent on the molecule itself, so the active ingredient. It was very atypical that it was on another component of the medicine, for example, the manufacturing process, the delivery mechanism, the device that delivers the medicine, although we did see examples of each one of those things in the patent term restoration data. And then, let's see. Also, which you might be able to guess from the earlier bullet point, nearly all of these were approved by the FDA with special benefits for being an entirely new active ingredient. So the takeaway being patent term restoration in the US, even though it doesn't specify this, happens to be very relevant to brand new active ingredients rather than new formulations. And in Canada, the law has actually specified it that way. Okay, so using this method, we were actually able to also give a breakdown of the exclusivity period and what has been protecting it. So it's I have a similar figure for the pre-market period. So I wanted to give you the post-market period. So on average, actually these are medians. So the median was 9.5 years left on the original patent term. And then there was a period of patent term restoration, which was almost 3 years. And then the median product did have an additional extension for pediatrics. And then we had generic entry happening a quarter after that. So there was a short time period of about 3 months where we weren't sure why generic entry hadn't happened sooner. But again, our definition of generic entry was whether patients actually had access to it. So it might have taken some time to get through the whole process before we start seeing it reflected in claims data. So this is the breakdown of the exclusivity period and what's protecting them. Okay, so for the first analysis, we were just interested in how long patent term restoration was on average. Remember, there was a period where there was a 2-year maximum, and then there's a period where there was a 5-year maximum. And then you have a limit on the total amount of time post-market that the product gets. So as you can see here, nearly all products hit their maximums, which fits with the Canadian experience as well, but there are some that kind of fall in the middle there. Okay, so for the second comparison, in this one, we're just seeing if the market exclusivity for drugs with patent term restoration was different from those that did not have patent term restoration. So we found that if it did have patent term restoration, it usually had a market exclusivity period of nearly 14 years. If it did not get patent term restoration, it was more around almost 11 years. So it's about a 2.5 year difference. So the problem with this measure is that it doesn't consider all the other reasons why generic entry might have been delayed. So we wanted to have a way to say, well, in this case, we're pretty sure it was because of patent term restoration, rather than some other reason or some other competing policy. So for this third comparison, what we did was look at the reality of what happened. So on this graph, it's kind of hard to see. What we have is the number of years after FDA approval. And then what's tallied here is when generic entry happened for these products. And in this bottom chart, we have a projection of what would have happened if there had not been patent term restoration. And the way that we got that was, again, by looking at the patents, or the instances in which patent term restoration happened when we thought it would. And any other time that it did not match that, we said, okay, in those scenarios, a different policy mattered more for generic entry. But when generic entry happened at the same time as patent term restoration expired, then we're saying patent term restoration mattered. So that will give us a more conservative estimate of how much this policy makes a difference. So this is the actual scenario with patent term restoration. This tall bar here, you can see, is is the 14-year maximum. So a lot of these drugs are getting their full amount on the market before generic entry occurs. So some takeaways. One is just simply that patent term restoration is having an effect. It's recognizable in the charts that this showed you. So you can see that this policy really is working. So by how much is it working? According to this methodology, it's about 2.5 years, or it adds about 22% to the overall exclusivity period. Again, most are reaching their limits because the drug development process, as defined by the laws, is so long. So there are some real benefits for innovation. And from I mean, there's some pro-business benefits that I think are pretty obvious. But there's also perhaps a less obvious function to those doing pharmaceutical policy analysis, which is that because patent term restoration is applied to new chemical entities, new therapeutic compounds, this policy helps distinguish those exclusivity periods from the exclusivity periods of products that are just simply a new version of an existing drug, which will help align the incentives the way we want, so that because developing an entirely new chemical entity involves a lot more most times than simply a new formulation, it seems important to have that distinguishing factor. So now switching to the access perspective, one of the challenges with patent term restoration is, of course, delaying generic entry. So what we did to just do sort of a back of the envelope calculation about how much was expended during this patent term restoration period for these drugs is we calculated for the drugs when patent term restoration, for the drugs when generic entry happened when we thought it would, according to patent term restoration. For that data set, we looked at how many quarters of patent term restoration were there, and then how much was expended for those drugs. So, almost 36 billion for those quarters, which was an average of 265 million per quarter, or about 88 million per month during that time frame. So a lot is spent then. I mean, bear in mind that if generic entry had happened sooner, this would still be a big number, but it would be a lot less. Even a brief extension, particularly for top-selling drugs, can come at a high societal cost. So it's important that these have an actual public health benefit to match. And I think, yeah, okay. One other point that is made in the paper is that there are a lot of competing policies aside from patents that will protect that exclusivity period. Data exclusivity is probably the most well-known one. Those usually last for a lot less time. So generic entry, based on these data, really does seem to happen when the patent expires. So if the patent expires way later than all these other policies, the actual empirical impact on that exclusivity period is going to be eclipsed by patent protection than these other policies. So that was a takeaway that we ended up making in the paper. However, I think it is important to acknowledge that things like data exclusivity matter for other reasons to drug innovators other than just the practical concern of protecting that market. When they have an additive level of protection, it is important for drugs that don't have patent protection because the molecule has been in existence for a while. And it also helps drug developers make an even stronger argument as to why drug investors should invest in their endeavor if they have double protection. So we ended up bringing up this point because Canada recently extended its data exclusivity protection for biologics. That is a big deal. However, there's also patent protection on the same products that may extend even further. So figuring out those that would actually benefit from that policy is a question of looking at the data and seeing. So let me stop there before I go on to the second paper. Are there any questions about this? Even broadly to the Canadian experience, why we're even talking about patent term restoration? Yeah.
So I guess my first question is, why would Canada consider doing this, considering the global market where innovation happens in different countries, and Canada is such a small portion of that market that it paying more for a drug probably has a small effect on innovation? Right.
Yeah. Should I repeat questions for the camera? Okay. So the question is about what motivates Canada to add these sort of innovation-friendly laws, given that a lot of these innovations are geared towards a broader global market. At least from my anecdotal experience, it has been that it's a compromise to get other things that Canada wants. So I think the related argument that more drug innovation-friendly policy that is put out there will help Canada grow its mark on drug development, and it will attract earlier registries of drugs. I think one clue maybe that we could take to heart is that they had a specific carve out to say only drugs that are registered in Canada in a timely fashion get the benefit. So I think maintaining that presence is important. Do you have other thoughts on that?
I guess there's just so many ways to pay off a drug company, right?
Yeah.
Like, why not just give them $100 million? You know, or like there's so many ways to do it. Why patent protection? Why not give them money?
Right.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because patent protection means something different for every company, and it depends on how good their drug is. And so are we incentivizing people who are blockbusters more than smaller companies? And is that the right thing to do? I don't know. There's just so many ways to pay them off.
Right. Yeah.
And it might be that you buy the drug outright, or you give them tax incentives to be in the country in the first place. Like there's, I don't know. So
right. And I think there are some of those policies in addition to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess one comment on that is, so there's a lot of talk about why not just extend the public funding model to the drug translation process of bringing it from bench science, which is publicly funded, to the market. And I think the reason why that hasn't flown, aside from now there's a huge commercial industry not wanting that to happen, is that the public would have to pay more up front. So kind of the beauty of the patent system is that no upfront investment from the taxpayer is asked for. It's only on the back end. So once we have something useful that can benefit everybody, then we're willing to pay for it. So there's some there's a huge disadvantage to that second system because you have less control over what innovations are created, whereas with the upfront public funding model, you've got your hands on the steering wheel a lot more.
I have one more question.
Great.
To another me. Do we know that, like hypothetically, I understand that this could produce more innovation, but it could also just produce more marketing.
Right.
And so do we have any evidence that this is good?
I don't know that we have any evidence yet that this is good. I think, you mean in Canada?
Anywhere, do we know that, extending patent protection or really any of the things that we might do to increase innovation by paying off pharmaceutical companies, does that work? And like what what is the elasticity of the money that we're spending on them for innovation? What proportion of that goes to innovation as opposed to paying off shareholders or increasing profits or increasing marketing?
Right. Well, certainly patents patents functioning in the pharmaceutical industry, we know that that works. So there is a lot of evidence that without the patent system, there would be different innovation. So that we know. So I guess by extension, extending that would also be a good thing. And again, going back to the anecdotal experience of watching drug developers pitch to investors, and the investors who are there don't have a public health interest per se. Their main interest is in investing in something that will be lucrative. So it certainly will help drug developers make that argument if they can say, we have a patent term restoration period as well. So that part of it I see as somewhat persuasive. There is a paper out by Joel Lechkin. So the average exclusivity period is thought to be around 12 years, no matter where you're looking. And he had a paper in Value in Health, which took a measure in Canada, and it was already 12 years. So adding patent term restoration on top of that would bring it up to 14 for a lot of products, and whether or not that's worth it, considering the public health benefit, I think is a paper waiting to be written. So I think certainly once there's more experience has accumulated, a lot more can be done. But we're only a year and a half in now. So okay, any other questions? Okay, so I'll quickly go through a second paper with the same data set. So this was in Value in Health. It was published in December. So what we noticed from that first project was how often patent term restoration was happening then, and it made us suspect, well, maybe we could use this to predict when generic entry is going to happen years into the future. And if we were going to do that, how successful would that be? And so there are a lot of really specific laws that you need to know, a lot of reasons why figuring out when the selected patent will expire is more complicated than meets the eye. So we developed a methodology to go through step by step on how you would make this calculation. And then the idea was, let's test it against this historical set and see if we can predict when generic entry would happen. And then we'll see if we can actually do this for drugs that have not yet gotten a generic, and just see if it's feasible. So this part was more of a feasibility test than anything. And again, the rationale for this is similar to the last project. It's sort of a health check of the system to see if generic entry is happening when you think it is. If it's not, if it's too soon, then that's a problem for drug innovators. If it's too late, it's a problem for those worried about drug access and public health benefit. So knowing this time point can be very important. It can also be used for those setting budgets as well. So that's the rationale for this. So right here we have a schematic of the various steps in making this determination. The most complicated part is distinguishing the type of patent. Is the patent describing a molecule, or is it describing something else only? Even if you don't do that step, what you could do is simply look at the regulatory pathway that it was approved through. Was it an entirely new chemical, or was it a new formulation? And sometimes that can give you a guess at what the type of patent will be that company selected to extend. So these were our results. By and large, it worked pretty well. We got the median prediction was that it was going to be 14 years. And what happened in reality was 13 3/4 years in terms of the median. So that's almost a perfect match. And then the interquartile range also lined up pretty well. But something interesting was that it was even more accurate if we just stratified by drugs with new active ingredients, and even better if we knew that the patent in question was a patent on the molecule itself. So the thinking is there that that's the most secure type of protection versus the other types of patents, because those are more easy to challenge in court. Whereas when it's a brand new molecule, that's often a more straightforward determination in court, and usually holds up when challenged. So for when we stratified by just those drugs, the average difference that we got from what actually happened was really narrow. So we could usually get it to within 1/4. Assuming a normal distribution, what this chart shows is the number of predictions that we made. And at year 0, which I've marked with a red line because it's kind of hard to see, is where it actually happened. So you can see that at the pinnacle of this distribution, our prediction was almost dead on. So that was pretty exciting. Now at the bottom, you can't see it here, but there's quite a wide spread as far as 10 years in some cases. And that's because as the drug development process is happening, they are filing patents all the way along as the product develops and evolves. And so sometimes one of those later patents turns out to be really important, and those expire later. So sometimes there are some big differences. This is another way to view the same results. Except these are the stratified results. So what you have here is the deviation from what we approximated for generic entry. These are for products that contain an entirely new active ingredient. These are for products that just have a new formulation. And we've just ranked them here by how much they deviated. And we thought if we can get it within 1/4, we're pretty happy. So between these two red lines would be that expected 1/4 time frame. So you can see for new active ingredients, quite a few lined up there. And for no new formulations, it didn't work as well. And this got even more pronounced in terms of the patterns when instead of doing it by the regulatory pathway, we looked directly at the patent and made a categorization that way. So when it was a patent on the molecule itself, our prediction was much, much more accurate. When it was on the new formulation, generic entry often happened sooner than we thought it would. It actually almost never happened when we thought it would. It was more often sooner and sometimes later. So that was actually a really important finding of the study. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And these are the results from our component where we applied this, this method to new drugs. So these are drugs that had recently been introduced and did not yet have a generic. So these are, at the time, future generic entry dates. And these are current top sellers. And one of these was actually within the same quarter as this publication, and that's for Lyrica. So I went to, out of interest, to see if generic entry had happened when we thought it would. It had not yet. Unfortunately, the resolution on this is not very good. But what you see here are a list of approvals for this drug in the United States. This top set here are the brand name products, and this top set here are tentative approvals that have been given for generic entry. So everyone is lined up to enter the market, and what is delaying them, I don't know, so I'll need to look further into that. But it is interesting that it still identified a critical moment in time when generic entry might happen. So it's encouraging to see that the method can help look through the weeds of all of these policies and boil it down to a single moment in time where we should be looking for generic entry to happen. Okay, so the takeaways from this is the method worked reasonably well, and that's a good thing because we want to know that the generic entry is happening in a timely fashion. It's not happening too soon or too late, and identifying this point in time allows us to say what too early and too late is. Show you the Lyrica example. So the method worked less well for new formulations and secondary patents. So the reason that was such an important finding is that there's a lot of discussion that drug innovators are bringing these, they're making small tweaks to existing products, and that those are too expensive, and it's unnecessary innovation. What this shows is that the practical experience is that those products do not often get their expected exclusivity period. So those drug innovators will face a lot of uncertainty and usually it's a shorter exclusivity period. So that would be evidence of a disincentive to develop those new formulations as opposed to entirely new molecules. And I think I made all of those points. So let's just return to the objectives in closing. So Canada recently implemented patent term extensions. This matters to drug innovators, it matters for drug access, and then we've gone over 2 examples of studies that I did in the US and hope to do something similar in the Canadian context in the future. And I think that's all I've got for you today. Any questions in the room?
Is there a way to measure the cost of some of these expected benefits? So you listed 2 benefits, early access and new entities.
Right.
Is there a way to kind of say what the cost of that is? Like how much of that patent extension is having on those 2 things and therefore the cost of those are?
Yeah, so You mean in terms of the expenditure during the patent term restoration period?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that was this. It is possible. Okay.
Which slide is it?
It's the end of the first paper. It is possible. And what you would need to do that is to know when exactly the patent term restoration period is, and then you can just look at expenditures during that period. And then there's a market erosion model that you can use to project what would have happened if generic entry happened sooner, and that could help you ballpark it in a more accurate way. So the estimate that I gave was just looking at the overall Medicaid expense, so it's enormous. But keep in mind those are top-selling drugs. So
the other piece of that would be measuring new entities entering the market and what the effect of patent extension on that and patent extension on early access to drugs. Is there a way to do that?
yeah, certainly for the first one, you could just stratify by the type of drug. But what do you mean by early access?
Well, one of the arguments you said is that you'd have that pharmaceutical companies are kind of saying, we need patent extension in Canada,
Okay.
and then we'll bring the drugs to market earlier in Canada.
Okay, so it'd be from the company perspective, what losses would they sustain if patent term restoration weren't there? Is that what you mean?
No, I'm thinking like from Canada's perspective, if the companies are saying that they're going to come to market earlier because we granted patent extension,
okay.
are they really doing that? How much time are we gaining in that early access because they're doing that? And what's the cost at the end when we could have had generics, but now we're not having generics? So just kind of comparing kind of the whole story of the benefit is early access.
Right. I think there is a way to do it. You would need to know what the status quo is before the implementation of this policy of how long the delay was to introduction in the U.S. and then look at that critical moment and if it happened any sooner. That would be a neat study. Yeah, we could certainly look at that.
We have one question.
Okay, so some other tactics to delay generic entry. So the most common, and it depends on what country or jurisdiction we're talking about. But the most common is just stacking more patents. That's the most controversial way to do it. But there are other instances where companies are not handing over samples so that generic companies can show bioequivalence with them. Because remember, even a month delay can add up to many millions of dollars. But the new biggest concern in the context of the US are deals between generic companies and brand name companies where they're called pay for delay deals, where the brand name company says, just delay entry by this amount and we will give you this amount. So those are very controversial arrangements because they're kept private. And that's probably the most important example, aside from other patents, to be aware of. Right, other questions? Okay, thank you very much.